welcome to episode number 135 of the Cheesesteaks and Controllers podcast, presented by Fox PHL The Gambler, 102.5 FM, 1480 AM, iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can download this show and listen to it. My name is Jason Finelli, and I am the esports and gaming insider for Fox PHL The Gambler. And after our special episode earlier this week with Mega Cat Studios and those fine folks talking about WrestleQuest, we have yet another fun interview segment for you this episode. One major talk with one developer from a game, or sorry, the representative from another studio doing a really cool project that I am very excited to present to you right now. So today on Cheesesteaks and Controllers, episode number 135, very excited for multiple reasons. If you remember this past November, I had the honor of reviewing Atari 50 for the Switch. I played it for Game Informer online, not their magazine online. That was made by Digital Eclipse, who has taken it upon themselves to turn their products into digital museums, which I really appreciate. They started with Atari, but now they're getting a little more focused, a little more they're going to spotlight one game as opposed to an entire company. That game being Karateka, which or Karateka. However, we've tried talking about pronouncing it, and I still got it wrong. But either way, I have the editorial director of Digital Eclipse here, Chris Kohler. We're going to talk about this project, and I am very excited to do so. Chris, how are you today?
Very good. Thank you for having me. Thank you for that review of Atari 50. We really appreciated that. Thank you for checking on the pronunciation of Karateka and everything.
Still got it wrong.
As you know, we address it in the product. There is a video actually in the interactive documentary, The Making of Karateka, in which I speak Japanese. In Japanese it would be like Karateka. I say Karateka in English, giving a little bit more R, just because that's sort of what's natural in English. Jordan Mechner, who created the game in the 1980s, didn't know Japanese, and it's not like it's just 1984. He can't just put on YouTube to find out how to pronounce it.
That's right.
He always said Karateka. Some people say Karateka, and really it's just like just pronounce it how you want. At this point, it's like it's just going to be impossible to get everybody to agree, and it's like ultimately we're all varying degrees of off of what the original Japanese pronunciation is going to be, because that sound that just doesn't exist in English. So just forget it. It's fine.
No, and it's amazing. Two letters in one syllable will do. If you just take away the ka and it's karate or karate, people have way less trouble with it. But I imagine that was already copyrighted back in the 80s. Exactly.
Yeah. And right. And I tend to say more like, I grew up, calling it, karate, and there's no ra and there's no T in there either. It's karate, the empty hand, right? So it's like, I don't know. It's just at this point, it's been 40 years and, we're no closer to a cure. Yeah.
Now, I understand the Japanese language is a very complicated thing. I'm actually teaching myself right now, thanks to that green owl on Duolingo, slowly getting through it. And it is quite a challenge, but a good one. I do appreciate it. So my first question about insert pronunciation of game here. So you went from Atari 50 and that entire history of a major company, 50 years of research and prototypes and design docs and all this, to one single game, 2 years worth of whatever Jordan had worked with at the time. So my first question is a simple one. Why this game? Why Karateka? What was the reason for this to be the first time you try the single game documentary as opposed to the company-wide doc?
Well, the funny thing is, and you would have no way of knowing this, of course, but I will tell you, is that really we went from Karateka to Atari 50 in that when I started working at Digital Eclipse in 2020, the first thing that I was put on was this project that had been going for a little while called The Making of Karateka. And I kind of came in, the people who had been doing creative on it were both gone at that point. And so nobody had the reins creatively. And I looked at where that project was, and I was like, I took a step back and I started doing the research from zero again, because I was like, I don't want to base my decisions here on what's already in this sort of like early version of the product. I want to go do the research again. So it's like, Jordan, the thing that makes Karateka so perfect, there's a lot of things that make Karateka perfect, and I will get to this to answer your question. one of the things that makes it perfect is that Jordan Mechner was a total like documentarian himself and a pack rat who saved absolutely everything. So as he was going along in college, like freshman year of college, he was making this game as a freshman at Yale University. That's when he started. In 1983 is when he started on this, okay? He was writing a journal, a daily journal, that he kept up, that he's actually kept up through his whole life. And he started writing a journal around that time and daily documented the process, everything that he was doing at college, but also everything he worked on that game. And so we had something that very few people have if you're trying to look at the history of how a game was developed, a daily log of everything that he was doing. Not only that, but, you know, what he was feeling when he was doing it, you know? So all of his teenage angst is right there on the page. And Jordan has published those journals, and you can buy those and read them right now. And then additionally, he did all of his designing like on paper, and he saved all the paper. And so all the paper, all of the design documents for Karateka, just stacks and stacks of stuff, is all in the care of the Strong Museum of Play in Rochester, New York, who we kind of basically partnered with to put this out. They gave us access to all of Jordan's materials and were extremely helpful. So basically at that point, I go back and I'm like, okay, I'm going to read Jordan's journals, of course, from start to finish. I'm going to go to the Strong and, you know, redo the research and say, what do you guys have? I want to make absolutely sure that we have everything pertaining to Karateka. Found a bunch more stuff. Found a lot of Karateka stuff in the Prince of Persia folders where it had been, you know, sort of accidentally missorted. And start to realize that there is a way to tell this story, like there's so much information, journals and design documents, and then we start looking at the contents of Jordan's floppy disks, because those had been preserved about 10 years ago, and by Jason Scott and the Internet Archive folks, and they had like gotten all of Jordan's floppies and, you know, done like very expert level stuff to try to get as much data as they could off of this shoebox full of floppy disks. And so there were like graphics, cut content and things like that, or like in development versions of Karateka. So we had as much, it's like no other game from 1984 is this well documented, unless, I mean, there's probably something similar for like Super Mario Brothers, but it's in a vault at Nintendo and we'll never see it. You know what I mean?
Unless they want to put it in. Right, yeah, sure.
Miyamoto wasn't writing a diary.
Nope.
So by taking all these parts, this was the fun as a former journalist, you know what I mean? Like, this was the fun part, because now I've got a diary in which he explains what he was doing that day. I've got images off a floppy disk, and I've got scans of paper documents, and he can start connecting the dots and matching that stuff up. So now, as opposed to a typical collection where it's sort of like, here's a design document, I can say, here's the design document, here's what Jordan said when he was writing this, here's what came out of it as an original, you know, or as a sprite on his floppy disk, and show all of those things together and lay it out all chronologically. So from a content perspective, Karateka has enough supporting content to let us do an Atari 50 sized, essentially. It's the same thing as Atari 50, where we've got 5, you know, chapters essentially that you can go through. It just gives us the ability to do that. And then as far as the game itself, one of the things that we want to do with the Gold Master series, which is this line of independently produced, self-published, interactive documentary style games, is, you know, we want to tell some of these stories of video game history that aren't being told. And one of the stories that's always told about video game history, and I'm guilty of this myself, is this idea of like, there was Atari, and then Atari died, and the video game industry crashed, and there was this black hole, and then Nintendo came riding in on a white horse and saved video games, you know, and that's like, there is something to be said for that in terms of the game console business in America. Right. But that's it, right? On first of all, for the rest of the world, that's not the case, and certainly on personal computers, that's where gaming kind of shifted to, and we just don't hear about these stories. And Jordan Mechner's Karateka was a profoundly influential game when it came out in 1984, in the middle of what some people just sort of consider the nothing time.
The doldrums, sure.
It came out in 84. It sold a ton of copies, and importantly, it made so many innovations in terms of the way that video games had presented cinematic scenes or cutscenes, animation. Jordan used rotoscoping, to achieve like lifelike animation inside of this game. In terms of soundtrack, Jordan's dad, Francis Mechner, who is sort of one of the heroes of our story, was a classical pianist as a hobby, and he composed the soundtrack in an era where games, certainly on the Apple II and on most other platforms, really didn't have music scoring them. But he did it in a really smart way, because he used this leitmotif approach where every character, every emotion, every setting had its own little stinger of music. So that lifted the emotional kind of, weight of the story as well. And so Karateka makes all these cool innovations, and it feels like a little movie, basically. That's how players perceive it. It's the first time they're playing a game on their computer that really felt like they're like the hero of an action movie. And that was so profound, and it inspired a generation of game designers. We went out to people like Tom Hall, the co-founder of id Software. John Tobias, the co-creator of Mortal Kombat, is in this. And they're in this discussing like how profound an impact, Karateka had on them. And we can, in that way, connect the dots and show why this game, which was, by the way, as I've kind of alluded to, is the directorial debut title of Jordan Mechner, who would go on to create Prince of Persia series, Prince of Persia: Sands of Time, Prince of Persia, the Hollywood film. Karateka was like this little egg, this little sort of like the tiny seed from which Prince of Persia would grow. And so it's important to look at it that way as well. And so as far as its importance to the industry, as far as it being a story that has not really been told, as far as it being an amazing story, there's a wonderful father-son story at the core of this whole thing, because, Francis Mechner, not only did he's like dad of the year. Like, not only did he compose the soundtrack to his son's game, support his teenage son in any way that he could to make this game amazing. When Jordan wanted to rotoscope somebody, his father put on his wife's karate outfit and went out into the woods behind their house in upstate New York and ran around in this karate outfit while Jordan filmed him with a Super 8 camera, and captured his dad's running and jumping and climbing motions, and then rotoscoped them into Karateka. Wow. And so when you see the Karateka running around, he rotoscoped two people, his mom's karate teacher for all the karate moves, and then his dad for all of the ancillary stuff like running and climbing and things like that, the non-martial arts moves. And that makes the two of them tied for being essentially the first like mocap actors ever in a video game. And again, it's this untold story that like, Francis Mechner is this like unsung hero of video games for all the work that he did on this. You don't really hear about him. And so we want to get that story out there. So it's a story that we're passionate about telling. It's a really important game. It's a story where we have all the ability to do it. And so I was working on this and we had to shelve it for a while because of so many other big projects coming in that needed all hands on deck. I was working on this before we signed Blizzard Arcade Collection. So it was this lightning rapid, like, Blizzard Arcade Collection comes in, need you on that. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the Cowabunga Collection, we need you on that. We actually, after Cowabunga Collection, we like had a kickoff meeting for Karateka to get it going again. And while that was happening, like, we signed Atari 50. And Atari 50 was just this great opportunity, though, because Atari needed something different. And we're like, you know what? We've got this interactive documentary approach that we've been workshopping internally, that we've been designing Karateka to that. And so we were able to put the brakes on everything else, get Atari 50 out the door in like record time, because we had to do it for the Atari 50th anniversary year. And then once that was done, finally had the time and the bandwidth to go back and not only to Karateka, but other stuff that's coming up later in the Gold Master series that we're working on now. So
Hint.
yes, yeah, it's a series. We've announced it's a series.
Love that.
And so that's happening. So I hope that gives you a little bit of insight into
It sure does.
why it's that game. Now, this is not to say like other stuff in the Gold Master series might be a bunch of games. It might be one developer. It might be one company going on. It's not necessarily just gonna be one game. But in this case, it's really all. And the thing is, there's actually 14 games in the Making of Karateka. Because there's Karateka for the Apple II, which was what Jordan created. There's the ports to the Commodore 64 and the Atari 800. We even speak with in the video sections Veda Cook, who actually did the conversion programming for the Atari and the Commodore version. So we get into the details of like, what was that like? What's it like to port something from these one very, very different platform to another, right? You have Jordan's original game shooter that he made called Death Bounce, which is what he was trying to pitch before Karateka. That got canceled, but it's in 4 different prototypes of that are in the game. Several prototypes of Karateka, and even Asteroid Blaster, which was basically like Jordan cloning asteroids. That's in it too. So across all of these things, we've got 14 different playable games in various stages of production. And again, like Atari 50, as you go through the timelines, when those versions come up, you have the chance to play them, and you have the chance to check them out, and then go back to the timeline and resume your of historical journey through the documentary.
So that actually answers a question that I had on the pacing. So with Atari 50, you're going through the history of the company, and you just put in the full games that you're talking about in that particular year. Here, with one game, are you breaking up the game into sections and they play those sections, or do they play the whole thing and then get the history? But if it's now like 14 different prototypes and the full games and stuff like that, it kind of makes more sense in my head as to how that would work.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just important that to note here that like you as the player have the option to dive in to one of these deeper sort of segments that, just as if you were at a museum, and you're going through the museum. You could either start at the beginning of the museum exhibit and just walk really fast through everything and just look at things that interest you and then be done. Or you can spend all day in there and just start at the beginning of the exhibit and then just go from, station to station. And if there's an interactive part of that, you can stay there and interact with it and exhaust all of the utility out of that before you move on to the next part of the museum. Depends on how you're feeling that day and just how deeply interested you are. So if you just want to kind of quickly go through the story, you can do that. But if you want to stop and play a game for a while, you can do that as well. Yeah. And nothing is locked. You know what I mean? You just have the freedom to just go where you want to go. We'll try to guide you to what's next chronologically, but you have this choice. Like, do you want to play Jordan's Asteroids clone? We even have watch mode for all of the games. So it's like, if you just want to watch a little playthrough of somebody playing Asteroids, do that. We don't. That's cool. And that gets even that's even more important when you're talking about a game like Karateka, which is actually kind of difficult. So it's like, if you just want to watch somebody play, we even have chapter select in the watch mode. So if you want to just jump to a certain part of the game and check that out, you have the option to do that as well. And for the Apple II version of Karateka, we have director's commentary on the watch mode. So you can watch somebody play through Jordan's original version while you listen to Jordan Mechner and Francis Mechner talk about extemporaneously, just sort of talk about the various things that you're seeing and the little bit of the behind the scenes of how that was put together.
That's awesome. I'm wondering, is he like reading through his journals and remembering his angsty moments as he's going through these, or is he just kind of talking about what he was doing at the time?
He is reacting to what's going on the screen. Basically, what we had, once we got the playthrough and we knew that was going to be we had to do it in order, right? It's like the playthrough is not just a video. It's actually like it uses emulator save states, because you can jump into the playthrough at any time and start playing. That's why the chapter select allows you to say, I want to practice that fight against the bird. Just jump right to it and then jump in and start playing. So it functions as chapter select. So we had to make sure that was 100% done before we went to Jordan and Francis, and I actually visited them in New York City in April. So it wasn't that long ago, and just sat them down with the demo, played the watch mode, set up like my phone, and just recorded them. It was a very ad hoc thing because we weren't really sure if we were going to be able to get them, because it was so late in the process. But it was like, we have you here, let's do this. And it wound up being very insightful. It was one take, totally just, off the cuff. But
that's cool.
But it's really brilliant. It's really fun to listen to.
That's cool. Now, we talked a little bit earlier about Prince of Persia and how this game kind of set the table for that. Is that referenced in the latter half of the timeline documentary portion? Do you get into like what parts of Karateka became part of Prince of Persia formula and how that flow works?
Yeah, so after Karateka, it was a big success, and Jordan and his publisher were both like, we got to do Karateka 2. So Jordan starts messing with new designs and things like that, and he was inspired, as you'll see, because there's an entire chapter that's just called Karateka 2. He was inspired by games like there's a Broderman game called The Castles of Dr. Creep, which was like a more like it had more like traps and platforming kind of stuff, and he was thinking, gee, I'd like to do something like that. So we actually have a lot of screenshots of sort of in progress stuff where he was working on a more platformy type Karateka game. He was using the Karateka characters. He was thinking maybe Princess Mariko would be playable this time. He had story treatments and stuff like that. But the game, you kind of see it like once you get to the final mock-up of Karateka 2, it starts to look a lot like Prince of Persia, not in terms of the character designs, but in terms of, the traps and doors and things like that.
Okay.
And that's kind of where we stop. And we're like, at past this point, it became a new project, which was originally called Baghdad, and that became Prince of Persia.
Okay.
So we stopped there. I don't want to say to be continued because we don't have the rights to do Prince of Persia, but it's like, but the story goes on from there. Yeah.
Right. And then people can do their own research and fill in the blanks from there.
Yep.
So you talked about also the black hole in the gaming industry that was filled by Apple II, which is what this was developed on. Do you take some time to go through that platform as a development platform to repeat myself? Do you go into like the technology of the Apple II and what was used to make this game as you did with the Atari consoles in 50?
Not super deeply.
Okay.
We do, in these interactive documentaries, as we do with Atari 50, we want to make sure that we're not just sort of taking the game ROM and just sort of plunking it down there with no context. Right. So we do want to make sure that, yes, people understand, like, what's the difference between these platforms? So yeah, as you're going through the timeline, so once we get to the introduction of like the Apple II or the Commodore 64, or the Atari, we talk a little bit about, well, when was that released? What were its strengths? So we talk a bit about that. You will glean some of that, especially from a lot of Jordan's commentary about the Apple II and what it was capable of, what the Commodore and the Atari were capable of versus that when we start talking about ports. But ultimately it's kind of out of scope to really start getting into the nitty gritty of how the Apple II works, even though it is very interesting. And to understand that platform does help you understand, why does Karateka look like that? Why does it use those colors? Well, the Apple II could only generate this small handful of colors. So every game has that orange blue kind of aesthetic.
Interesting.
And the interesting thing about that I found out as I was doing this is that the Apple II doesn't have color hardware.
Oh.
Steve Wozniak basically figured out a way to use it. The Apple II, technically, the hardware can only do luminance, basically, like black and white, right?
Sure. Yep.
But he figured out ways to send signals along that black and white pathway, basically, to juice, your monitor. You'd have to have a color monitor, obviously, but he would get the monitor to be able to display those colors. It could only kind of display them in certain areas. So if you shift a pixel over that was blue, it becomes orange. You know what I mean? It's one of those things where it's like,
interesting.
That's what Apple II programmers had to figure out. It's like color was not just put this color there. It was, and that's why when you look at Karateka and other Apple II games, you see what seems to be like sloppiness of the colors. You'll see something that's orange and it'll have a blue pixel in there somewhere. And that's literally just because the Apple II is doing color in a very strange way without color hardware. Right. So that's something that would be a little too much to include. Although it is a really interesting story.
That is. Maybe if there's ever a Gold Master series on the Apple II itself, That would be a good place to put that.
And I think, and that's a really good observation, because it's like with the Gold Master series, like it doesn't necessarily have to be about like a game,
right,
or even games. You know what I mean? There could be, it's like it's and that's what's important to get across here, is like we're not like selling you Karateka.
No,
like I don't want to sell you like this game ROM. This is about selling you the story, the documentary. Even if you aren't really interested in the game, the pitch here is like the story is so interesting that it's the meat. It actually is the core user experience.
So if someone were to come to you for a potential pitch in this Gold Master series, if you even accept them, what would be your requirements? What would you and Digital Eclipse want or need even in order to even consider doing something like this for another project, whether it be a single game or an old developer or even the platform, as we've talked about? What sort of information and how much of it would you need in order to have that jumping off point?
I think ultimately we would just want to make sure that it's something where there could be just a variety of different things. I mean, maybe the game itself is so well known that people are already so passionate about it that we'll just figure out what the story is and tell that story. Okay. But if you were to come to us and say, well, I've got this game and nobody's really heard of it, but the story behind it is so fascinating, I think we would take that as a really interesting challenge of, can we take something that's got no fan base whatsoever, but the story is so good that we think that if we get it out to people and put that context around it, we will actually create fans of this game. I think we would like that challenge as well. So it's really just like, I feel like everything has a potential argument for it, whether it was, like whether it's already got fans or whether it doesn't have fans, but if there's a good story there, if there's a story that we can tell, it's something that we'd be interested in.
I can think of at least 2 or 3 different projects off the top of my head that I would love to see get this treatment, but we can bypass that. I don't want to start saying you should do this, because I'm sure you get enough of that on social media and stuff like that.
It's not, ultimately, well, I mean, we do, and we, like, cards on the table, it's like, I like to hear, like, you should do this, especially when it's something that's, like, on social media and it's kind of quantifiable, because ultimately, it's not like we're sitting around with a big list of games and we're going, let's do Super Mario Brothers. It's like,
throw a dart.
Like, yeah. No, it's really trying to convince rights holders to go in with us, and take a chance on us and do it this way. And so if we have more of a sense of what do people want, that gives us a little bit of ammo. That's like, we have all, fans are asking for this. Like, this is what we hear about a lot. So it's good to hear, but also it's like, don't, mistake the process of, we're just picking whatever we want. I wish maybe in 20 years, if we really establish ourselves, people will be falling all over ourselves to, get Digital Eclipse to, to include something in the Gold Master series. But that
would be awesome. So I want to ask also, I know we kind of touched on this a little bit, but did you find focusing on the one story and the one game, even with the wealth of information that you ended up finding from the museum up in Rochester, did you find this to be a little more challenging to build enough of a story to get through those 5 chapters, as opposed to the first time you did this, where you had 50 years of information to dig through? This one, a little bit more focused. I'm just wondering how challenging it was for the team to get that story. Did it become apparent like right from the jump?
Yeah, I mean, within like the first, once I really started reading the journals, and once I really started looking at and asking, because it was really, so my first week or two at the company back in 2020, because literally this was what I was put on, and I was just like, okay, let me get the information. Once you start looking at it and realizing there's just so much there, but I think that I also had a 25-year career in journalism prior to that, and I mean, so much of that is, there's all this information out there. How do you perceive what's important? How do you start to see a story take shape in this sort of mass of seemingly unrelated events? And so writing big magazine features, big 5,000 word features, you start to develop a little bit of a sense of, that can go in, that can go in. That's important. Once you start connecting the dots, I mean, I think that's kind of the big thing. So maybe it's something that somebody without that experience might not have perceived.
Right.
But from my sense, it was like, yeah, this. I mean, there's a huge story to be told here, and we just gotta put it all together.
Now, in retrospect, you mentioned that Karateka was actually supposed to be first, and then Atari 50 kind of took over in this documentary-style format. Do you actually think that going through Atari first ultimately benefited Karateka, as opposed to if you had launched them the other way around? Do you feel that basically doing the trial run with 50 years of Atari made this one even better in retrospect?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, 100%. Because there's so much that, like, again, like, Karateka was in the works, but Atari, it's like we had a deadline and we had to finish it. And finishing something is very important, because you do 90% of the work, and then after that, you do the other 90% of the work at the end. It's like just getting something completely, totally finished out the door. It allowed us to really just like bang on a lot of our initial ideas and like preconceived notions and really test it out in a product. And then of course it's very fortunate we released Atari 50, reviews were very good, and importantly there were a lot of people who got what we were doing, because as the first sort of test flight, it's like, what if people don't understand this? What if people hit start on Atari 50 and they're like, where are my video games? What is all this stuff? I mean, that could have happened.
What is happening?
Yeah. Like, where's asteroids? I can't find asteroids, And we did a lot to make sure that both of those types of players, if you just wanted a list of games, we gave you a great games carousel that would be, sorted and, had, a lot of information about each of those games to help you make that decision of what to play. But if you wanted to go through the timelines as your primary kind of, user experience, you wanted to make sure that you had access to all of the games that way as well. And the fact that people picked up on it, and what's interesting with Atari 50 is that when Atari 50 was announced, I think a lot of people paid it no attention and were just like, oh, it's another collection of Atari games. Okay, I don't need it.
I made that. I will admit, I made that assumption as well.
Well, the Game Informer review came a week or two later, I think, after release.
Yes.
And you typically don't see that happened with IGN as well. And that happened with, it wasn't a review, but that happened with Kotaku's coverage as well. And I think that's actually great, because what it means is it came out and there was this sense of, oh, oops, like we should have, we should have covered this.
This is a little bit different.
This is something different. This is something unique. We actually need to go back. And, it's not often that after that initial review cycle, somebody's going to go back, and cover it. And so it's wonderful that happened, because it really, it made it very clear that people were picking up on it. Oh, this actually is something different. And the benefit then to the Gold Master series is now we're like, here's our next interactive documentary. And we've got tons of people already who are just like, oh, like Atari 50, this is going to be good. So it really, that's very helpful. For us, for launching the indie thing. That's more of a risk, where the risk is all on us. Where it's being announced. Very fortunately, we're really lucky. Very grateful to have it announced on the ID at Xbox Showcase, which was awesome. But still, ultimately, there's no big publisher here, like with a big marketing machine. It's just falls to us. And so, it's scary, and it's risky, but it is what we believe we need to do, to treat, these classic games, which we believe they're not just like old, products that you sell in the bargain bin. Like, this is the foundational art on which the video game media is based. And we believe we need to treat them with more respect. And so this is a way that we're trying to do that.
Now, you touched on something that I wanted to make sure I asked you about, one of the last things we talked about, because I imagine it's going to be a heady topic here, and that is preservation. Last week, that report, or 2 weeks ago, the report came out that 87% of games ever released are no longer available on any platform. Blew my mind, just because I assumed that you could still get some of the weird games that I played as a kid because I still have them. So people probably still have them. But no, a lot of those games aren't available anymore. Did you see that and start to think, okay, maybe we're on to something with this Golden Master Series? Maybe we can bring that number down by getting some of these titles back out into the forefront or the spotlight, even if it's a little spotlight. Like Karateka, as great and foundational as it is, it like only for old folks like me and you, older folks, not old folks, who have been playing games for a long time, we know about it, but the youth now won't until this. So have you guys kind of like taken up that mantle a little bit? Like, all right, if there's a preservation issue and they're not going to do anything about it, if they'll partner with us, we'll do it.
Yeah. So, I mean, we believe there's a role for everybody in all kinds of different organizations as far as game preservation. You know, the Video Game History Foundation wants to make this extremely salient point because they're arguing for, alterations to copyright laws, essentially, that allow libraries and institutions to provide for video games remote access. Because ultimately, it's like 87% of games, according to this study, the only way that you can access them is either A, piracy, or B, you just can't. And so if libraries just simply can't do it. I mean, there's games. Look, if you want to go pirate a laser active game, you can't do that. Like you have to have a laser active, set up.
That's
but
true.
If libraries and institutions were able to set up and provide remote access for these things, then that would give researchers, or quite frankly, not just researchers, but just, everybody, the opportunity to play these things within a legal framework where they do not have to. I mean, when we're talking about one of the other things that we want to do with the Gold Master Series is bring back computer games, because a lot of times what you see are collections of console games. But when you start looking at the libraries of computer games, you don't actually see personal computer games being brought back as much, and you don't see them on game consoles because it's one thing to re-release a computer game for a computer, because Karateka used keyboard controls, right? And you needed keyboard controls to get through this. So what we're doing, and we have engineers essentially working on this for Karateka and for other stuff in the Golden Master Series. It's a big task, a big, expensive engineering task. Have a highly paid engineer sit down and spend days and weeks essentially taking computer games and rigging them up so that you can use a console controller to interact with them.
Love that.
And so with Karateka, it's like, even if you wanted to just, pirate it, you're still dealing with all of the intricacies of like it's like I use emulators all the time, and just getting a computer game running can be like, okay, we get this Apple II emulator. Okay, well, how do I mount a disk image? Once I do that, what do I have to type anything? I mean, God, I'm using like a Commodore 64 emulator. It's like, for people who grew up with Commodore 64, they're like, oh yeah, type load, comma, ampersand, so like, all this stuff, and you run the, and then you run it. But it's like, I don't remember this. I have to go look it up, and I have to go look this information up, and this information is on some forum post. Like there were times when I'm trying to emulate something, and the answer is buried in some forum post from 2008, and it's God. Like, this is not sustainable.
No.
We can't keep doing this. Like, this is why when the Video Game History Foundation points out these games are like critically endangered, it is because all of the rigmarole that you have to go through and this sort of fragile ecosystem of like homebrew hackers and pirates that are propping it all up is it's not sustainable, and it's disrespectful, and it's something that we should be working a lot harder to preserve. Now from the Digital Eclipse perspective, we can't save every game by putting out products like this, especially because look, we're making the Making of Karateka, but it's like, when does our game become incompatible? It's like, what happens 20 years from now through no fault of our own, where if we can't go in because, What if the development environment for the Making of Karateka gets deprecated decades down the line and we can't even update it anymore? What if the storefronts that it's available on all shut down? Then either the way that somebody would access my creative work would be through, one would hope, remote access via a library. I don't want this to go away, but I understand that it will unless there's institutions that are able to provide it to people, or they'll just pirate it, And so, but from our perspective, all we can do is like the work of like, what is it? It's like, it's a massive forest and we can save like one tree. You know what I mean? Like through doing this. But I mean, I think it's what we're doing adds to preservation. Absolutely. Especially, even with like Ninja Turtles, the Cowabunga collection,
Love that collection, by the way. Loved it.
Thank you very much. And there's thousands of pages of design documents from Konami's internal archives that now exist in extremely high quality, I think 4K on some consoles, digital form. Whereas in the past, before we embarked on that project, they existed as a piece of paper in a building in one of the countries that is beset by the most natural disasters of any place on Earth. If an earthquake didn't get them, a typhoon was going to get them. You know what I mean? So it's like, by doing the project and by having it, because if somebody other than Digital Eclipse had done a Turtles, collection for Konami, they might not have said, yeah, we want every document, and people are just like, why is this collection however many gigabytes it is? It's just X number of ROMs. And it's like, no, because we successfully argued that it needs to be this. And so from a preservation standpoint, we actually did do great work on that. And so that's the same thing with, Making of Karateka and things far in the future, is just getting those physical documents, turning them into digital documents that are now everywhere. Everybody has them, and it helps preserve that information in a really substantial way. And so we feel that pressure too. But then also we know that bonus, that what was considered, used to be considered the bonus content, really for some people is the whole show. Right.
Now, do you think? I mean, obviously, game companies can be doing more to preserve their own games. I don't think that's not opinion. It's absolute fact. Would Digital Eclipse ever consider partnering with a big publisher, if for no other reason than to just show them how you do it? If you're not going to use us, at least let us show you what we're doing so that you can maybe do it yourself. We'd love to do it for you. But
I see. Yeah, I mean, like, in a sort of a consulting sort of way. Yes. Yeah, hit us up. Like, we're down for whatever. You know what I mean? Like, we're not like desperately, like, we're not going to go out there and be like, you may not, do something this way. If everybody adopts our approach to classic game or archival game releases, we'll feel very proud that we were able to, essentially flip the script and change the way this is like, it's our business, but it really is a cause that we all believe in. Like, we want to preserve video game history, we want to do our part, and we want to treat these things with the respect that they deserve. And if that gets other people doing that, great. If that gets other people saying, oh, geez, like, Digital Eclipse does a really good job on these, we got to hire them to do our next thing, also wonderful, so yeah.
Now, I'm wondering, is there any, and if you don't want to answer this question for fear that people might think that you're working on it, that's fine, but is there any older game that you would love, like from your youth, but you're like, man, I haven't played this in a really long time. I wonder if this is one. Like, if you were the Twitter
right, yeah.
If you were the guy on Twitter saying, hey, Digital Eclipse, do this.
Yeah.
What would that be?
Does Shigeru Miyamoto listen to your podcast?
I had Reggie Fils-Aimé, episode 100, so maybe.
Okay. So maybe he does.
Friend of a friend.
Yeah. So Miyamoto, just call me. You have my number. No, I mean, seriously, like, it sounds crazy, but like, I will say this all the time, like, absolutely, Nintendo, get in touch. Like, I think that what we do could actually complement what they have as far as the online subscription service, the context is not there. And the thing is, the pitch to publishers is really this. Like, if you're just taking the games and putting the games out, the audience that you have is going to be people who are already kind of like excited about those particular games. But it's like, we can help create new fans. So if there's something that is dormant, by putting these things in their proper context, by doing it, whether it's the interactive documentary format or whether it's something like Cowabunga Collection, but by putting this stuff in context and introducing it to new audiences. And like, one of the things we found with Atari 50 is that there were a lot of people who just anecdotally on social media or in reviews would say things like, I don't really like Atari that much. I've never been an Atari fan. I did not grow up with Atari. I've never been interested in it. But in going through the documentary and learning about these games and learning about where they came from and why they were important and who worked hard on them and learning what to look for when I play these games, then after that, when I play the games, I become more interested in them. Mm-hmm. And like, that is the magic of doing it this way, which is getting somebody who did not have any interest and getting them to the point where when they do play that game, suddenly now they're a fan of Food Fight for the Atari XL or whatever it is, Sure. And so like, that's what's so important about this. And so that's really my pitch to publishers and like why you want to let us do it and why we want to do it this way.
Yeah, and which makes a lot of sense because, like you mentioned, Nintendo. I can think of a ton of games in their portfolio that haven't seen the light of day in years that could really benefit from this sort of complimentary service, like you're saying. Star Tropics is one that comes to mind immediately. Right. Because nobody knows what that is outside of like us and Eric Bailey on Twitter, who I talk to every once in a while. He's always mentioning Star Tropics. That would be a perfect idea. And every company has games like that are deep buried in their archives and haven't come out in forever, even if at all. And I just think there's a lot of merit to that, not just in the preservation of what did come out, but also in the history of these companies that we may not know about. I feel like you might even have a possibility of, and maybe you might not agree with this, of a series where it's just all unreleased games or all prototypes from a company that never saw the light of day until now, and here's why, and here, stuff like that. Would that be something that you guys would be interested in too?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, like Karateka is this really, really great test bed for so many things that we want to do. Because we haven't really even gotten into a lot of the stuff about like, I mean, one of the other things that we do in Making of Karateka is, so we knew that Jordan used rotoscoping. The Strong Museum had preserved and digitized that Super 8 film of his dad running around. We had all the steps in the process because what he did was he filmed his dad. He took the film with a movie editing device and then traced the frame onto a tracing paper. Good and then Lord. He took a device called a VersaWriter, which was this very, very early device with like a stylus for the Apple II, where you had your stylus and the stylus was attached to a mechanical arm, basically, like on a tablet. And you move the mechanical arm around your drawing, and it would start recreating that on the screen in front of you based on the movements of the arm. And then that's how he digitized all the frames. This was an incredibly laborious process that took months. And then once he had the digitized, versions of the tracing paper, was able to animate that, and that's how he got like human animation. We have an interactive thing called Rotoscope Theater, in which I went back and took that video, found the exact frames from the video that he traced with tracing paper, that he digitized, that became Karateka Man on screen. And you can compare real life footage of Francis Mechner with final in-game sprite as if you're in like Photoshop, lay them on top of each other and awesome. See how the real life maps the game. And you do it in an interactive way. And so that's kind of like, that's something else that we can do. So Karateka is like a test bed for a variety of different things. We have a 15-minute audio-only podcast in the middle of Making of Karateka, in which Kirk Hamilton, my former coworker, does the Strong Songs podcast. He basically does a little mini Strong Songs for the Karateka soundtrack. And
that's great.
and he just breaks it down as far as like, this is why this music is so good. And so we're just like, we're putting everything in the kitchen sink into Making of Karateka in terms of weird, wild, wacky ideas, the director's commentary and all that kind of stuff, to show like, here are just some ways, that we can do this interactive documentary format. We can tell the story of this game in a variety of different ways. And so going on in the process in the future, it's like we'll come up with even more stuff that we can do. Basically. And it'll all depend on the first step in this process is, well, what's out there? Like, what does the company have internally? What can we go research and find on our own? And then the shape of it sort of follows from the information that we have.
That's awesome. Do you hear? These are the lengths that these folks are going to make sure that the history of video games is told in a way that is succinct and informative, and most of all, entertaining. And I have a feeling that the history of Karateka or Karateka or however it's pronounced will be one that is told very effectively, just as Atari 50 was last year. Chris Kohler, thank you so much for your time and your information, and the interview was great. I look forward to seeing the history of Karateka when they're making Karateka. Whoa, when it comes out, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon when we're talking about the next great Gold Master series from Digital Eclipse. Chris, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
And with that, we are at the end of episode number 135 of the Cheesesteaks and Controllers podcast. As always, presented by Fox PHL The Gambler, 102.5 FM, 1480 AM, and iHeartRadio. If you're listening to these words, you've gotten to the end of the episode, and I very much appreciate your time. And I hope you were entertained and informed. And I will be back again next week with the greatest and latest in video games. So I hope you have a fantastic weekend. I hope you have a better week right behind it. And like I said, we'll be back again next week with more Cheesesteaks and Controllers. Bye-bye.